The storm outside was merciless that night, rattling the windows of the mansion, as if the heavens themselves were furious at what was about to unfold. Inside, Elena sat on the edge of her bed, her hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her belly. She whispered words of comfort to the life growing within her, soft lullabies that carried more hope than melody. The child had already become her anchor, her purpose, her reason to endure even the silent distance that had crept between her and her husband. She thought this house was her sanctuary. She thought her marriage was her shield. But shadows move quietly in gilded halls, and her greatest enemy was the very man who once vowed to protect her. Victor, her husband, was a man carved from steel and ambition. To the world, he was the perfect CEO, sharp in his suits, magnetic in his speeches, adored for his brilliance. He built empires out of numbers and turned rivals into dust. People admired him, envied him, even feared him. Yet within the walls of his mansion, where the lights dimmed and the applause of the world faded into silence, another man emerged, cold, calculating, and distant. Elena felt it every day now. The warmth had vanished from his touch, the smile from his lips, the tenderness from his eyes. Each night he returned later, his mind buried in secrets, his words clipped, his presence suffocating. When Elena discovered she was pregnant, her heart soared with joy. She dreamed of decorating nurseries, of gentle family walks, of a love that would deepen with every heartbeat inside her. But when she shared the news with Victor, his reaction was not joy. It was silence. A chilling, suffocating silence that lingered like poison in the air. He had stared at her, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting away, as if she had placed a burden on his shoulders, rather than a gift in his arms. From that moment, Elena knew something had shifted. What she didn't know was that her pregnancy threatened more than his peace of mind. It threatened his empire. Victor's wealth was vast, his power unmatched, but his empire was built on careful control. A child would complicate inheritance. A child could bring vulnerability. And more than that, in Victor's twisted world, love was a liability. He could not afford to be weakened by a wife and child when his rivals circled like vultures, waiting for a crack in his armor. So, behind the locked doors of his office, Victor made a choice that would define the rest of their lives. He signed a contract, not in love, not in loyalty, but in betrayal. The man he reached out to was no ordinary mercenary. He wanted someone efficient, invisible, unquestionable. And so the offer was sent to Adrian, a Navy SEAL with years of combat experience and a reputation for being unbreakable. The money was obscene, a sum so high it was meant to ensure silence and obedience. Adrian didn't need the money. He never had. What he lived for was duty, for missions that demanded his strength, his discipline, his sacrifice. So when the call came, framed as just another classified assignment, he didn't ask questions. He never expected that the target would be family. Adrian remembered Elena only in fragments. Childhood summers filled with laughter, chasing fireflies in the backyard. Her gentle voice always comforting him when he came home scraped and bruised from climbing trees or playing too rough. She was not just a cousin. She had been his safe place before war stole his innocence. Years had passed since they last met, but the memory of her kindness still glowed like a lantern in his mind. As he prepared for the mission, he buried those memories deep, convincing himself this was just another operation, just another nameless target. But fate has a cruel way of revealing truth. On the night of the mission, Elena sensed something was wrong. The air was too still, the shadows too heavy. She moved cautiously through the mansion, every creak of the floorboards magnified in her ears. Her hands instinctively wrapped around her belly, shielding the child inside her, as if she could feel the danger closing in. When the intruder finally appeared, a figure cloaked in darkness, her body froze in terror. The knife edge of panic pressed against her throat. She was ready to scream, to fight, to run, anything to protect her unborn child. But then the figure's mask slipped, and the world stopped. It was Adrian. The shock was so immense it stole her breath. She hadn't seen him in years, yet his face was unmistakable, sharper now, worn with scars of war, but still carrying the echoes of the boy she once knew. Tears blurred her vision, 100 emotions colliding in her chest. Fear, betrayal, relief, confusion. Why was he here? Why was he pointing his weapon at her? And then, in a voice cracked with disbelief, she whispered his name. In that moment, Adrian's heart cracked open. The mission, the orders, the money, all of it dissolved into ash. Before him stood not a target, not a contract, but Elena, his cousin, his blood, his family. and she was carrying life within her. His training screamed at him to finish the job, to obey the contract. But his soul roared louder, protect her. Adrian lowered his weapon, his decision made in an instant that would forever change his life. He would not betray her. He would not harm her. Instead, he would turn against the man who had orchestrated this, the very man who was supposed to love her. Victor's betrayal was complete. He hadn't just hired a mercenary. He had unknowingly summoned a protector. From that night forward, Elena's world would never be the same. She was no longer the wife of a powerful CEO. She was the hunted, the woman carrying a child her husband wanted erased. And Adrian, once a soldier bound by orders, had now become her shield, her guardian, her only hope of survival. But Victor was not a man to accept failure. When he discovered Adrian's defiance, his fury burned hotter than the storm raging outside. He unleashed everything at his disposal: private security, money, influence, to track them down and finish what he had started. Elena and Adrian would soon find themselves fugitives, running not just from death, but from the cruel machinery of power and greed that Victor commanded. Yet in that terrifying first night, as the storm battered the windows and thunder echoed in the sky, one truth stood unshakable: Elena was not alone. She had someone by her side who had once promised, long ago in childhood innocence, to never let harm come to her. And in the darkest hour, that promise came alive again. The storm had not eased by morning. The skies were heavy, bruised with rolling clouds, and the mansion stood in eerie silence as though it had witnessed too much in the night. Elena barely slept. Every time her eyes closed, she saw Victor's cold stare, the man who had once promised her forever, but had instead signed away her life. Every sound outside the window sent chills up her spine. She clung to her belly, whispering to her unborn child as if the soft words might weave a shield of protection around them both. Adrian paced quietly in the shadows, alert to every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind. His instincts screamed at him to move. Staying inside Victor's territory was suicide. But he knew Elena was fragile, exhausted, and frightened. Her body carried not just her own weight, but the weight of another life, and he couldn't demand the impossible of her. He crouched beside her, his voice low and steady, like a calm tide washing over chaos. He promised her that he would keep her safe. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But a part of her still trembled with disbelief. How had her life unraveled so quickly? By nightfall, they left. Adrian led Elena through the back corridors of the mansion, places he had memorized within hours of entering, the way only a Navy SEAL could. He moved with ghostly precision, his hand steady on her arm, his eyes scanning every shadow. They slipped out through the gardens, where raindrops glistened on the roses like tears. The storm cloaked their escape, drowning out footsteps and muffling voices, but freedom came at a price. Victor had already realized the mission had failed. His private security forces had been mobilized, armed men patrolling the grounds like wolves on the scent of blood. The first confrontation came sooner than expected. As they reached the outer wall of the estate, 2 guards spotted them. Shouts pierced the night, and flashlights sliced through the darkness. Elena's pulse thundered in her ears, panic clawing at her chest, but Adrian reacted in a blur. He pulled her behind a stone pillar, his movement swift and practiced. With lethal precision, he disarmed one guard, knocking him unconscious with the hilt of his weapon, while the second fled into the storm to sound the alarm. Adrian grabbed Elena's hand and whispered sharply that they had to run. She stumbled but followed, her body aching, her breath ragged, her mind screaming that she couldn't keep up. But when she looked at Adrian's face, etched with determination, she found strength she didn't know she had. They fled into the night. Through fields drenched in rain, across dirt roads turned to rivers of mud, into the cover of the darkened forest. Every step carried them further from the mansion and deeper into uncertainty. Elena's legs trembled, her body begged for rest, but she kept moving because stopping meant death. Adrian never let go of her hand. He knew the forest gave them cover but also slowed them down. He listened to the distant echoes of engines, the crunch of boots on wet ground. Victor's men were relentless, their search widening like a tightening noose. For 3 days, Adrian and Elena stayed on the move. He taught her how to stay quiet, how to steady her breathing, how to listen for danger before it arrived. They sheltered in abandoned barns, empty hunting cabins, and once beneath the branches of an old oak tree, while rain poured like a curtain around them. Adrian scavenged for food, sharing every bite with her, though hunger gnawed at him too. Elena, once sheltered in luxury, now found herself learning the raw lessons of survival. Yet, amid the hardship, she discovered something else: she was stronger than she ever believed. And Adrian, though hardened by years of war, found himself softened by the sight of her courage. Each night, as Elena lay curled on whatever hard surface they found, she whispered to her unborn child promises of safety, of love, of a life beyond fear. Adrian would sit nearby, keeping watch with weapon in hand, but her words reached him too. They reminded him of what he was fighting for, not just survival, but hope, the kind of hope he had lost long ago in the deserts and jungles where his missions had taken him. Victor, meanwhile, spun his web tighter. To the public, he portrayed himself as the grieving husband, feeding the media stories that Elena was unstable, that her mind had fractured under the weight of pregnancy. He cried crocodile tears on camera, vowing to bring her home. The world saw a victim. Only Adrian and Elena knew the monster behind the mask, yet Victor's lies gave him power. Police and authorities looked for Elena, not as a victim, but as a runaway, someone who needed to be captured and returned. Every headline turned public opinion against her, painting her as unfit, fragile, lost. And that made their escape even more dangerous. They were not just fugitives from Victor's private army, but from the entire system he controlled. It was during one of those nights, in a crumbling warehouse on the edge of town, that Elena broke down. Her body ached, her spirit wavered, and tears streamed down her face as she whispered that she couldn't do it anymore. She didn't know how to keep running, how to carry life within her when death chased them at every turn. Adrian knelt before her, his hands steady on her shoulders. His voice, firm but gentle, reminded her that she wasn't alone. He told her that she had already endured more than most could bear, that her strength wasn't just for herself, but for the tiny heartbeat within her. And for the first time in days, Elena allowed herself to lean on him, to trust that maybe he could carry the weight when hers grew too heavy. From that night, their bond deepened. They were no longer just cousins tied by blood. They were survivors tied by fate. Every step forward was a step together, and every danger faced was a battle shared. And though Victor's forces grew closer with each passing day, though the walls of pursuit seemed to close in around them, they found something Victor could never understand: courage rooted in love, not in greed. But love alone would not save them. Adrian knew they needed proof, something that could expose Victor's betrayal to the world. Without it, Elena would never be believed. And so, even as they hid, Adrian began gathering the evidence, tracking down Victor's encrypted messages, tracing payments to offshore accounts, uncovering contracts that bore his signature. Each piece was a weapon, not of violence but of truth. And truth, once unleashed, could destroy even the mightiest empire. Still, the clock ticked relentlessly. Elena's body was growing heavier, the baby pushing closer to birth. And with each day, Victor's men tightened their search. The final confrontation was no longer a distant possibility. It was inevitable. Adrian knew that soon they would have to face Victor, not in shadows, but in the open. And when that day came, everything would be decided. Not just Elena's survival, but the fate of her child, Adrian's soul, and the legacy of a man who had traded love for power.